Well, I think the next target for men will probably be Mars.
NASA was seriously planning to put men on Mars in the 1980s.
Aliens exist and President Trump knows about it. That's according to Israel's former space security chief.
He also claims that astronauts from the United States have been to Mars and are working alongside the extraterrestrials at this Mars base.
There's no reason not to think that Mars and all these planets don't have life.
Hi everybody, Chad here. This episode today will be a continuation of the last episode I did, Werner von Braun, the secret space program in Mars. I decided to make this a part 2 because the deeper I look into this stuff, the more new interesting information I uncover. Now I don't know what it all means, but it's definitely worth having a look at. So sit back, relax, and get ready to open your mind because we're going deep. And I think that this war in the Middle East right now, you know, the one that has the Armageddon end time zest feel to it, the one that is absolutely destroying this world's economy, I think that this all may be related somehow to the secret space program.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
Man, we're containers. That's how supposedly the aliens look at us.
It would be a shift in the knowledge of humanity, new knowledge.
What the hell is going on?
Sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself all at once. Like an archaeological dig, you have to brush away the layers for days, weeks, or even years before you understand just exactly what you're looking at. At first, it's just fragments. But as you keep digging and uncovering, you start to realize that these random pieces are kind of connected. And some things are buried by time, and other things are buried on purpose. So today, I want to continue on what I was doing in the last episode, just uncovering evidence of a secret space program. And I don't have all the answers for how things are connected. So let's just uncover things and let the evidence speak for itself. And we're going to start with a guy named Mordecai Vanunu. Mordecai was a technician who worked at Israel's Dimona nuclear facility in the Negev desert. Its official name is the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center. He worked there from 1976 to 1985. And what's interesting about this place is this is not a nuclear power plant that supplies electricity through the electrical power grid. This is just a nuclear research center. So it's nothing to see here. It's just an atomic science nuclear research center for peaceful applications, like in agriculture, health, and science. And that's it. No nuclear weapons, that's for sure. And nothing else strange or disturbing. I mean, after all, this is Israel we're talking about. But apparently, that is not the case. As Mordecai was working there over the years, he began to realize that they were processing a lot of plutonium. And plutonium is used in nuclear bombs. And he said that beneath the facility, underground, there were levels that were far larger than what was publicly acknowledged. That they have entire rooms dedicated to separating plutonium from reactor fuel. And that they had equipment that was used for building nuclear weapon components. He began to realize that Israel was just not experimenting here, but they were producing. And based on what he saw, he concluded that Israel had already built a significant number of nuclear warheads, and far beyond the amount that the public had suspected. So he secretly took about 60 pictures of inside the facility, interior rooms, machinery, layouts of the underground structure. He knew that Israel was up to something that they were not supposed to be doing. Now, there were always rumors floating around for decades that Israel maybe had nukes, but there was never any concrete evidence that they did. And now, he finds himself right in the middle of it. And as the years were going on, he was becoming more disillusioned with Israel's own policies, with the way they treated the Palestinians and the way that they lied to the world, and the fact that he had his own role to play in it. Well, this began to bother him to the point where he quit his job and left the country. He went to Nepal, Thailand, and eventually he made his way to Australia. He spent some time in Sydney, and there he converted to Christianity and became more publicly outspoken. He stayed there a little while, and eventually he decided to go to London, England, because his plan was to blow the whistle. Now, he didn't go straight to the press. He wanted to find someone that he could trust with his story. And eventually, he connected with a journalist who worked for the Sunday Times. This paper was already interested in investigating global nuclear programs. So they took Mordecai's pictures and listened to his story. And then they brought in nuclear experts to look at these photographs, his description of the facility, plus all the technical details he could provide. And the experts concluded that this information was credible. And it did seem to reveal that Israel likely had a large undeclared nuclear weapons program. In fact, Mordecai felt that they had up to possibly 200 nuclear warheads, which, as far as nuclear arsenals go, that would put them at number 6 in the world. Now, of course, this is a nuclear bomb of a story, so the Sunday Times, they sat on it for a while. And unfortunately for Mordecai, when he was shopping around his story, one of the places he went to was the Sunday Mirror. Now, they initially turned him away, but news of his story did travel all the way to the top of the company. And this company is owned by a guy named Robert Maxwell. He's a rich, billionaire British tycoon, and he also happens to be a Mossad spy. So, of course, when he got word of this, he tipped off the Mossad to let them know what was going on. Now, if this Robert Maxwell guy sounds familiar, it's because he's Ghislaine Maxwell's dad. And, of course, Ghislaine, Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend, and co-conspirator in whatever they were really up to. My theory is they were scouts for the Breakaway Civilization. But back to Robert Maxwell. He also owned a publishing company called Pergamon Press. And this is the company that Eric Weinstein accuses of gatekeeping science. Eric says that basically his monopoly on science books allows them to slow down unorthodox ideas, which can act as like a type of control valve or gatekeeper on science itself. So I find it interesting that this Robert Maxwell, billionaire, tycoon, Mossad spy, and scientific gatekeeper is also acting like a gatekeeper for the real science that Israel is up to. Now back to Vanunu. After speaking with the Sunday Times journalists, he had to wait a little while for them to do their investigation and their whole write-up. So he had some time to kill in London. And while he was there, he met this really cute girl named Cindy. And Cindy convinced Vanunu to travel with her to Rome. And when they got to Rome, they immediately got in a car and were off to her place. He said that she was hot and heavy all over him the whole drive. And then they got to her house. He walked in the door, and he was immediately attacked by two men and a woman. They drugged him, took him to a beach, put him on a small boat or a type of yacht, and chained him up. They were out to sea for about 7 days until they arrived in Israel, where he was eventually tried and convicted of treason and espionage and sentenced to 18 years. And 11 of those 18 years, he spent in solitary confinement. They clearly did not want this guy talking to anyone. Even during his trial, they went to extreme measures to make sure that he could say nothing to the press. He was forced to wear a type of motorcycle helmet with straps to prevent him from speaking to the media. And if he would try to speak and say something, they would turn sirens on to drown out his voice. And there is a rumor that they even wired his jaw shut. Now, to me, that just shows me how close to the truth Vanunu is. Makes you wonder why they just didn't kill him. But maybe they wanted to make an example out of Vanunu, so people would think twice before betraying Israel. Now Mordecai's out of prison, but he's never allowed to leave Israel for the rest of his life. He's not supposed to talk to any foreign media, although that hasn't stopped him. And he's not allowed to go any closer to an embassy than 200 meters. But when asked, he said he would do it all over again, and that he's proud and happy of what he did, and he was acting from a deep internal conviction that Israel does not need nuclear arms. And there's something that a lot of people don't understand about Israel. Because Israel officially does not have any nuclear arms, they don't officially belong to any of the nuclear arms and atomic energy councils, like the IAEA. That stands for the International Atomic Energy Agency. So because they supposedly don't really have any, they aren't a part of any type of formal organization that comes in and holds them accountable. They have no oversight over their entire nuclear program and can do whatever the F they want. So that's probably why they want to silence people like Vanunu, and will probably never admit to actually having nuclear weapons and atomic things they shouldn't, because they don't want anybody snooping around what they're actually doing. And as time goes on, I'm becoming more suspicious that nuclear weapons aren't the only thing that they're up to. I got a feeling that they're doing something else with this nuclear energy that may be connected to a secret space program. And it's all because of something called the Apollo Affair. Now, this was a Cold War era incident that started in 1965. And it's centered around a nuclear fuel production company called NUMEC. NUMEC stands for Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation. And this facility was in a town of around 2,000 people called Apollo, Pennsylvania. And their specialty was turning highly enriched uranium into usable nuclear fuel for reactors. And their biggest customer was the good old U.S. Navy. They provided the fuel for the reactors in their aircraft carriers and fleet of nuclear submarines. And if you listen to the last episode, you'd know that I think that the Los Angeles-class submarine is somehow connected to a secret space program. Now let's keep digging into this Apollo Affair scandal and see what we find. So, the gist of this scandal is that over a number of years, about 600 pounds of highly enriched uranium had gone missing from the facility. They can't seem to account for it. It's called uranium-235, and it's what they used in the bomb they detonated over Hiroshima. And enough of this stuff went missing to build somewhere around 20 of them. And to have this all happen in the mid to late 60s, during the height of the Cold War, is kind of a big deal. Or at least, it should have been. But to this very day, no one's ever been held accountable for this. So let's look at exactly what happened. From 1965 to 1980, the FBI looked into the New Mech Apollo, Pennsylvania facility. And they were focused on the president of New Mech, Dr. Zalamain Shapiro. He just so happened to be a strong supporter of Israel. He was a longtime Zionist who even served as the president of the Pittsburgh chapter of the Zionist Organization of America. I mean, when it came to Israel, this guy was all in. I even read an article in a Jewish magazine when he died at the age of 92. And they talked about how much he loved Israel, and that all he ever wanted to talk about was Israel, and that this guy would do anything he had to for Israel. And the FBI were looking into this guy because they were suspicious that the uranium that had gone missing went to, you guessed it, Israel. Man, why does everybody pick on Israel all the time? Poor fucking Israel. So, of course, Shapiro had all kinds of connections with important people in the Israeli government, and he even had a contract to build nuclear power generators for Israel. Now, the FBI wasn't the only organization investigating NUMEC and Shapiro. Also, the Atomic Energy Commission and the CIA were also looking into this. But after like a 15-year investigation, they just couldn't find a thing, and no one was ever charged with a crime. Now, even though no one was ever charged, just looking into this, it's pretty easy to see what happened. In 1976, the CIA told a Nuclear Regulatory Commission that they believed the missing uranium had gone to Israel. And this news worked its way up to the White House, and nothing happened. The advisors to President Jimmy Carter at the time concluded that the CIA's idea was convincing, though not completely proven. But the basic gist of what they suspected was going on there kind of sounds like an episode of Breaking Bad or something, because they were exploiting a loophole in nuclear accounting. Of course, in every process of refining something, there's going to be a certain amount of loss, and the industry standards for losses when processing highly enriched uranium at the time were around 0.2%. But the years that Dr. Shapiro was the president of NUMEC and running the plant, their losses weren't 0.2%, they were 2%. And that discrepancy is what the investigators believed was a masked diversion. And in a 1972 FBI memo, they theorized that the way they got it out of the country and to Israel is by putting it in some type of lead or nickel plating. And that would shield its radiation and make it safe to transport. They were thinking that it easily could have been put in some type of diplomatic bag or pouch, or maybe some type of Israeli merchant ship, or even El Al Airlines. And the calculation of exactly how much uranium had gone to Israel, they figured was somewhere around between 200 and 600 pounds. There's even record of a Mossad agent named Rafi Eitan visiting the facility in 1968. He had a team of 4 people with him, and he went there because Dr. Shapiro invited him. Now, of course, they weren't advertising that they were Mossad agents. At the time, they posed as a group of scientists who were there because they wanted to buy plutonium-238 for power sources. But the investigation found it, as they put, extremely hard evidence of an intelligence operation. And one former Pentagon official said that there was no conceivable reason for Iran to have gone but for the nuclear material. And the year that he visited just happened to coincide with the highest year of uranium losses at the NUMEC plant. And on top of all this, the US government even paid NUMEC for the loss. So I think it's pretty easy to see what's going on there. There is something that these individual agencies were trying to uncover, but the higher-ups in the US government did not want it to be uncovered. So they did what they had to do to just keep it quiet. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Well, not me. Now let's have a closer look at this Dr. Zalman Shapiro guy. Now this is where things start to get kind of interesting, because he was a brilliant chemist. During World War II, he worked on the Manhattan Project, and in the early 50s, he was selected to work at the Westinghouse Bettis Atomic Power Laboratory, which just so happened to be building the reactor for the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. And the work that Zalman did there made him stand out, and he became a key figure in the Navy's nuclear program. And through this, he ended up having a close professional relationship with the head of the entire program, Admiral Hyman Rickover. Now, in the last episode, I talked about how Rickover was in charge of the Los Angeles-class submarine program, and how he was basically untouchable. Different politicians tried to kick him out of his spot a number of times, but every single time, he had key people in Congress to protect him. Rickover operated on another level of power. He could basically do what he wanted, and he even stayed in the Navy for like 60 years, longer than anyone else in history. He clearly was protected by powerful people behind the scenes. And that close relationship with Rickover is the entire reason why he was at NUMEC in the first place. In fact, that may have been the reason that NUMEC even started at all. So after the Nautilus program had proved that nuclear power was the future, Shapiro, with the help of a wealthy investor, founded NUMEC in 1957. They bought an old steel mill for like $500,000 or something in Apollo, Pennsylvania. And because Shapiro had a lot of favor with Admiral Rickover, in fact, Rickover cited him as one of the 4 individuals most responsible for the Nautilus program's success. So he was able to leverage his close ties with Rickover to win lucrative contracts to produce nuclear fuel for the Navy's growing fleet of nuclear-powered submarines and ships. And this steady stream of work from the government provided a steady stream of cash, which allowed his company to exist and grow. And it's almost like Rickover's untouchableness kind of wore off on Shapiro. He always publicly praised Shapiro's work, and for some reason, with all the accusations and investigations from the FBI, the CIA, and the Atomic Agency, Shapiro never lost his high-level security clearance, which is really unbelievable. And I think it just goes to show that these guys are connected and protected on another level. Now, let's have a look at Dr. Shapiro's silent partner, his investor, the guy that gave him the money to buy the steel mill and start this whole shindig in the first place. Well, this guy's name was David Lowenthal. This guy's kind of a shadowy character who is deeply involved with the founding of Israel. He was a former member of the Haganah, basically an early version of the IDF before Israel was a nation. and he fought in the War of Independence in 1948 for Israel, and he was also an international refugee smuggler. He had ties to arms smuggling networks that supported the creation of Israel. He was even a close friend to Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. And one of the guys he fought under would later become the head of Israeli intelligence. So this guy was connected, and he was able to provide Shapiro with the capital that he needed to buy the Apollo Steel Company in 1955. And all this information I have, this is not conspiracy stuff. This is not from the dark corners of Reddit. This is publicly available information. And there's a quote from a former CIA station chief who said that NUMEC was an Israeli operation from the very beginning. Which, just looking at it, it's kind of obvious. But we can't stop at just Israel. You have to remember how Israel started. It was always the project of the Rothschilds and other billionaire Jewish Zionist families. So it is directly tied to these elite billionaire pedo weirdos. Or you could say, the Breakaway Civilization. Is that how guys like Shapiro and Rickover were untouchable? Because the US government, they weren't covering for Israel. They were really covering for this breakaway civilization. And to make things even more interesting, the Apollo Steel Company was bought in 1955, and over a couple years or so was transformed into the NUMEC facility, and then started making nuclear fuel for nuclear reactors for the Navy. And they also made fuel for the NERVA program, the nuclear engine for rocket vehicle application. Remember Werner von Braun's book, Project Mars? He envisioned having the ability to get to Mars by using nuclear rockets. In the last episode, we talked about how they worked on this program up until 1973, and that Werner von Braun had given a speech to Congress about going to Mars. And the official plan was to build a base on the moon by 1980 and boots on the ground by 1982. Von Braun was a major advocate for these nuclear rockets, and he would say stuff like, chemical rockets can put boots on Mars, but nuclear rockets can build cities on Mars. So I think it's interesting that the NUMEC facility, that according to that CIA station chief, was always an Israeli project from the very beginning, made fuel for the Mars NERVA program. And there's something else that I think is kind of interesting. There's a guy named Abe Silverstein. He was one of the top dogs at NASA when it first started up in '59. His official title was Director of Spaceflight Programs. And he was also a major advocate for the nuclear rocket propulsion program. And he picked a guy named Harold Finger to become the director of the Space Nuclear Propulsion Office and NERVA development. But what I find kind of interesting is that Abe Silverstein was the guy who named the Apollo program the Apollo program. And as the story goes, he was sitting at home one evening browsing through a book about Greek mythology, and he was struck by an image of Apollo riding his chariot across the sky in front of the sun. And he felt that this evoked the grand scale of this proposed moon program and humanity reaching for the moon in a bold, almost mythical endeavor. But I don't know. I just find that quite the coincidence that this NUMEC facility in Apollo, Pennsylvania, that exists just to make fuel for the Navy's nuclear reactors and for the Mars rocket NERVA program, and the fact that Abe Silverstein was a major advocate for this Mars nuclear rocket Nerva program. I don't know. I just find it kind of strange that he would pick the name Apollo. Like, think about it. The sun itself is a nuclear reactor, and a fiery chariot racing before the sun, it kind of gives the feeling of nuclear power at a cosmic scale. And to me, that imagery seems more in line with harnessing nuclear energy for space travel than simply just going to the moon. And considering that the New Mech facility's main customer is building nuclear reactors for the Navy, and I'm already suspicious that the Navy nuclear submarine program is actually a cover for a secret space program spaceship building program. And on top of that, there's something else that's kind of strange and weird. The company that specializes in building nuclear reactors for the Navy program and the Mars Nerva program is called Westinghouse. And they're built at Westinghouse Astro-Nuclear Laboratory, just a few miles outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the main world headquarters for this Westinghouse Electric Corporation is about 5 minutes from Mars. Pennsylvania, that is. I've actually been there once. It's a cute little town. But I don't know, I just think that's kind of weird. I'm suspicious that they've been going to Mars since the 80s, that they were building up spaceships and stuff to go to Mars, hidden in the submarine program, and the world headquarters of the company that builds reactors for possibly spaceships to Mars is located 5 minutes from Mars. Now, how does that work? Now, I don't think this was intentional. I don't think they had some type of meeting in an underground bunker trying to plan all of these names and things out. Sometimes I wonder if it's the universe trying to communicate to humanity that something's going on. That these things just happen to line up for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Who knows? But it's interesting that around the same time they were building this New Mech plant in Apollo, Pennsylvania, in Israel, they were building the Dimona Nuclear Research Facility in the Negev Desert. And wouldn't you know it, the Dimona reactor was all done and ready for its first load of fuel on December 26, 1963. About 1 month after the public execution of JFK. Now, that year leading up to his death, Kennedy was pressuring Israeli leaders, and he was warning them that the U.S. would be seriously jeopardized if it could not obtain reliable information about the Dimona reactor. Of course, he realized that Israel was going to develop nuclear weapons, and he was determined to put a stop to it. Or at least that's the official story. But I think that there is something going on behind the scenes. That Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex taking over government, I think that that's what JFK and others were trying to avoid happening. And whether it was the Dimona Nuclear Research Center or pursuing a space race that was not international. At the time, Kennedy was proposing a joint venture moon mission between the U.S. and Russia. And the day he was executed, he was on his way to the Dallas Trade Mart to meet with the guest of honor, elite scientist Lloyd Berkner, and he was going to make some type of announcement of a government joint venture in the Dallas Research Facility, because Kennedy was interested in cooperation. He wanted to partner with Russia and civilian science labs to work at going to space as a joint venture. But the military-industrial complex, they were interested in competition. They didn't want to partner with their enemy to go to space together. I mean, after all, they might achieve world peace or something. They wanted a space race. They didn't want cooperation. They wanted competition. And that's exactly what they got. So instead of partnering with the Russians to go to the moon, they had to beat the Russians and get to the moon first. And they were able to use it to fuel Cold War propaganda and pull the wool over humanity's eyes. They eventually got to the moon in '69, and then a few years later, shut everything down. And when you take a closer look at this rise and fall of NASA and the space age, the nuclear power industry seems to have the same rise and fall at almost the same time. The nuclear age and the space age both started in the mid-1950s. They both peaked in the early 70s, and then they shut everything down. Now look at this. The U.S. launches its first nuclear-powered submarine in 1954 and its first commercial nuclear power plant in 1957. And then in 1958 to 1959, they had the International Geophysical Year. And after that, they officially formed NASA. And then they progress until they eventually get on the moon in 1969, land there 6 times, and shut her down in '73. And when you look at nuclear reactors at nuclear power plants, the first ones were built in 1957. And by the late 1950s, they were all the rage, and they even had an initiative called Atoms for Peace. It promoted nuclear power as limitless, clean energy. The world became convinced that nuclear power was the source of the future, and they began building nuclear reactors all over the planet. And by 1967, the U.S. led the world in total nuclear capacity. And wouldn't you know, in 1973 was the industry's peak year. 41 new units were ordered. And then it all went downhill from there. They had this great boom in the 60s, and then this great reversal in the 70s. The costs started to spiral, licenses were being delayed, and then dozens of plants were canceled. And the real blow came in 1979 with the meltdown of a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. That accident inflicted a fatal psychological wound on the entire industry. And the strange part is, 3 Mile Island was a brand new nuclear reactor. It officially came online December 30th, 1978. And it melted down 12 weeks later on March 28th, 1979. Of course, it was this huge national crisis. And at the time, President Jimmy Carter, 4 days after the reactor melted down, he actually went to the site to visit. He wanted to show the public that it was safe. And do you know when he just happened to visit that site? He just so happened to visit that site on April 1st, 1979. April Fool's Day. And on top of that, he just so happened to be a nuclear engineer. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1946, and he went on to serve in the nuclear submarine program under Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. Remember that guy? The father of the nuclear navy? The guy who stayed in the Navy for 60 years. He headed up the Los Angeles-class submarine program, and he was notorious for being difficult to deal with, almost uncontrollable, and the politicians could not get him out because he had friends in powerful places in Congress. And as I was doing research for this episode, I'd come across the Naval Institute YouTube channel, And on it, they had this naval historian or propagandist talking about the relationship between Jimmy Carter and Admiral Rickover. And he talked about how when Jimmy Carter was running for president and he started actually getting some traction, Rickover had him shadowed during his campaign. He had people watching him, listening to his speeches, and reporting back to Admiral Rickover on what he was saying. And after he won the presidency, Rickover would advise Carter on policy issues. He would tell him how to deal with military contractors and how to work and negotiate contracts with these shipbuilding and submarine companies. And he even advised him on domestic and foreign policy issues. Now, of course, all presidents had to deal with Rickover, but this relationship seemed a little more closer than some of the past presidents. And this historian also said that Rickover had a custom of taking new presidents onto nuclear submarines. They would go out into the ocean and even underwater for a time. Now, if that's true, and considering my kind of suspicion I have about who Rickover is and actually connected to, makes me wonder if it was some type of initiation. Or maybe that's where they get to talk about what's really going on, while they're sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Who's going to hear them? Who knows? I mean, once you get suspicious of things, your mind can go wild places. But the fact is, there was a special bond between Carter and Rickover. There's actually a quote from Jimmy that says, "Next to my father, no one has had more influence on me than Hyman Rickover." And on top of that, Jimmy Carter, when he was running for office, he openly talked about how he had seen a UFO. And he promised that if he got elected, he would look into the whole UFO situation and find out what was really going on. Now, in the last episode, I talk about that supposed famous incident where Jimmy Carter had the talk, where some military dudes told him what was really going on with the whole UFO alien situation, and he supposedly put his head into his hands and wept. I wonder if Rickover was in the room when that happened. I mean, if my theory is correct, that Rickover is a gatekeeper for the Breakaway Civilization, and that his Los Angeles-class submarine program is actually a cover for building spaceships to go to Mars, well then maybe Rickover would actually be the guy to tell him. And the last thing I'll add to the Carter-Rickover relationship is that when he took office, Rickover gave him a plaque. Now this plaque is something that Rickover would customarily give to new captains of nuclear submarines. And inscribed on this plaque was something called the Brenton Fisherman's Prayer. And it says, "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." And Carter kept that plaque on his desk in the Oval Office. Now, Carter isn't the only president that Admiral Rickover ever gave the Brenton's Fisherman's Prayer plaque to. He also gave it to JFK. And like Carter, JFK kept that plaque on his desk in the Oval Office. And now that I've got my spidey senses tingling, and I'm real sus about this guy and his relationship with politicians, I don't know, it kind of makes me wonder. Is that fisherman's prayer a type of threat? Oh God, the sea is so great, and my boat is so small? It makes me wonder if that's just the Breakaway Civilization saying, don't fuck with us. I mean, it's clear to see that Kennedy was really pushing the limits on things, and Carter wasn't. He ran on nuclear proliferation, but when he gets into office and the NUMEC Apollo affair is presented to him, he just sweeps it under the carpet. Even historians scratch their heads about that one. And that is exactly what Rickover would have wanted. And maybe when Rickover took Carter on the presidential submarine ride, maybe he told him that's what you have to do. You have to sweep this under the carpet. And also, don't say anything about UFOs. Their ride did last 9 hours, so who knows? And I found something else interesting about Rickover. When he was the project manager of the Nautilus nuclear submarine project in the early 50s, he had a close associate that he worked with named Alvin Rodkowski. And Alvin moved to Israel, and he personally led development of Israel's nuclear program. That's strange. In fact, Rodkowski specialized in miniaturizing nuclear reactors. He went on to help Israel develop new types of nuclear reactors, like some thorium-based ones. And I think that this represents direct transfer of top-tier classified knowledge from Rickover's inner circle to the Dimona Nuclear Research Center. In fact, there was a number of Rickover-trained nuclear scientists that actively aided Israel in their nuclear development. So it's clear that there is some type of connection between the Apollo NUMEC facility and the Dimona Nuclear Research Facility in Israel. And now, as far as what they're really doing at the Dimona facility in Israel, other than building nuclear bombs, well, I'm not quite sure. But I bet you they are in some way servicing this breakaway civilization's agenda. And they sure don't want Iran to have their own nuclear program. And I don't think they're scared of bombs. Maybe Iran knows what they're really up to, and maybe is doing it for themselves or something. Who knows? But there's just too many weird connections and coincidences to just leave this alone. So I guess all we can do is see how things play out and what new information comes to light with this whole shit show going on in the entire world right now. But when I look at the rise and fall of this atomic age, it kind of looks like to me like they were trying to scare the shit out of the public so they'd forget about nuclear energy. And just the very fact that Carter visited the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown site on April Fool's Day? Please, we've seen that before. And on top of it, Jimmy Carter just so happened to be a nuclear engineer. And he also just so happened to have helped clean up a nuclear meltdown in Canada in 1952. Now, I'm not saying that those things are made up or even lies, but it does seem to fit with societal conditioning. And it just may be a part of a type of cultural mask that is put on over society to hide what they're really up to. And the real truth may be that they never did shut down the space program in '73. They never did cancel the Nerva rocket. They never stopped trying to go to Mars. But they used the competitive space race to get huge funding with top secret classification and built a space program that left the planet. Remember, Werner von Braun said that nuclear rockets could build cities on Mars and start in 1982. You know, I was listening to an interview with Arthur C. Clarke the other day. That's the guy who wrote 2001 Space Odyssey with Stanley Kubrick. He was heavily involved with places like Bell Labs and other scientists and cutting-edge tech. Now just listen to what Arthur says about NASA's intentions for Mars in the 60s.
You know, because the whole space program is sort of on hold now. But it's hard to remember that when we worked on 2001, from 1964 to 1968, roughly, NASA was seriously planning to put men on Mars in the 1980s. Well, now we haven't put men back on the moon yet.
Well, there you have it. They were planning to go to Mars in the 80s. And the fact is, our real history may be that in 73, they started building spaceships hidden in the Los Angeles-class submarine program. Then they landed on Mars in the early 80s and have been building a base there ever since. I mean, that's a wild thought, that there could be humans living on Mars right now. In fact, that's what that guy, Dr. Hayam Eshed, you know, the guy mentioned almost every episode? He's the 30-year Israeli space security chief. He's called the father of Israel's space program. And he said in his 2020 book, The Universe Beyond the Horizon, that there is a base on Mars with Americans and aliens. So there's that Israel connection again, too. Now let's just take a closer look at Dr. Hayam Eshed, since I talk about him so much, and let's just see, what's his deal? Is he some goon that just fell into his job like a, I don't know, Pete Hegseth or something? Or is he a squared-away scientist like the rest of these guys? Well, Hayam served in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. He held degrees in aeronautics and electronics, and he served in Israel's highly secret Unit 81. It was a technology and innovation division connected to intelligence operations. They specialized in creating custom cutting-edge intelligence and espionage tools for the military's most elite combat units. Kind of like James Bond's Q workshop. You know, where the car would spray oil out the back or have guns hidden in the lights or something. And this unit is so secretive that most IDF soldiers aren't even aware that it exists. Its motto is, make the impossible possible. Now, during the 60s and 70s, Hayam became very heavily involved in satellite and reconnaissance technology. In 1979, he was advocating for Israel to develop its own satellite capability. And the idea was that satellites could provide independent intelligence gathering for Israel without having to rely on its allies. So he oversaw the development of Israel's military reconnaissance satellite systems. He was involved with the launch of more than 20 satellites. And he helped establish Israel as being one of the few countries that's capable of independently designing and launching satellites. And also, Israel is one of the few countries that can actually launch their own satellites into orbit themselves. So Hayam played a major role in establishing Israel as a space-capable intelligence power. And he was the director of the space program for the IDF for over 30 years. So this guy's security status had to be top-notch. And if there's anyone that's going to have to know what they're actually up to in space, this would be the guy. And plus, Israel military technology programs have always been intertwined with U.S. defense contractors. So his field would have definitely overlapped with U.S. military intelligence structure. And that is what gives Hayam's wild claim about Mars, the Galactic Federation, and aliens. That's what gives it some weight. He actually had the job that you would have to maybe be privy to this information. And because he's not just a politician, where you get voted in and then have to be read into the program, this guy was the program. He is the scientist. And remember, in Israel, he's referred to as the father of the Israeli space program. And in 2020, at the end of his career, he released a book called The Universe Beyond the Horizon, Conversations with Hayam Meshed. And in this book, this father of Israel's space program talks about how there is a galactic federation and that there is a secret plan between the U.S.-Israeli governments and multi-species galactic federation Star Trek-like council. And he also said that there is a secret underground base on Mars, and the Galactic Federation has a facility there. It's staffed with astronauts and extraterrestrials, and that humans are already working with aliens on Mars, and that U.S. astronauts are collaborating with the aliens inside of this base. He also said that the Galactic Federation has helped save humanity from nuclear apocalypses and some type of unspecified incident during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Oh, he also said that apparently we haven't really been told what space and spaceships actually are, and the Men in Black are real. But the part that convinces me the most that I think that this may be true is the fact that when Trump found out about this, he said he was on the verge of telling everybody, and that the Galactic Federation had to convince him not to, warning that it would cause mass hysteria. Now I can just picture how this probably went down. Trump gets elected, and he's in that meeting where he finally has to find out what's actually going on. Then he says something like, "Come on, let's get it over with. You better tell me the truth about the aliens." And some nerdy Smithers-type guy says, Sir, we belong to something called the Galactic Federation, and we also have a joint base on Mars with aliens. Sir, are you tweeting this as I speak? Sir, get the stun guns. Well, at least that's how I picture it. And when I first heard that grabbed my attention. And when I checked out his credentials and his reputation, it became hard to just deny or push to the side. The only thing that people can say to knock him is that he hasn't provided any evidence. And that's it. That's all they can say. His life and career speaks for itself. So like I said in the last episode, until proven otherwise, I consider this hard evidence. And if all that is true, then this has to be somehow intertwined with the war that's going on in the Middle East right now. I'm not sure how, but it's gotta be. And back to Hayam's book. Sad part is, it was only printed in Hebrew. Of course, that figures. To me, that convinces me even more that what he's saying is true. No, I'm not saying that this is the full truth. For all I know, this could be part of some type of psyop. After all, Israel is the aggressor in the Middle East right now. They are having this war on purpose. But all anyone can do is just look for patterns. Let the patterns tell the story and see how things unfold. And as I've been researching stuff for this episode, one of the patterns I've seen that I think is kind of weird is that the origins of the space program really do stem from Nazi scientists from Operation Paperclip. The Nazis were all in trying to find ancient civilizations and ancient technology, and even built experimental aircraft like the Nazi Bell that looks like early versions of flying saucers. And after the end of World War II, around 1947 and on, there were all kinds of sightings of flying saucers. And many of these sightings included abductions or interactions with the pilots of these flying saucers. And there were many accounts of these pilots wearing German military-type uniforms and even having German accents. They were tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. And there are some who argue the Germans already had a secret space program for themselves, and that they had actually landed on the moon before the end of the war. Which I'm happy to believe in something crazy like that, if I could see some shred of evidence. But what we discovered today is during the mid-1950s and on, a lot of these connections to a possible secret space program, they're not Nazis. They're not Germans. They're guys like Abe Silverstein, Admiral Hyman Rickover, Dr. Zalamain Shapiro, and his funder, David Lowenthal, who probably got his funding in some connection from the Rothschilds. And we can't forget Hayam Ashed. All these guys have something in common. And it ain't being a Jehovah's Witness. And it isn't being Jewish. What they have in common is Zionism, a belief that sees Israel as a fulfillment to biblical prophecy. And it's that very idea that allows the state of Israel to exist. And as long as it does exist, it destabilizes the entire Middle East, which ends up serving corporations and certain families, and really, the breakaway civilization. But it is kind of strange that this secret space program starts with Nazis and ends with Zionists. At least it seems that way. Which you would think would be in complete opposition to each other. But maybe, at the root level, they are one and the same, an arm of the breakaway civilization. And as I was doing my research, I came across something that I'd never heard before, as I was looking into the idea that the rise and fall of NASA and the space age are at the same time as the rise and fall of the atomic age. And I realized that they wanted to make people scared of nukes, 3 Mile Island, and they also wanted to discourage the public from wanting to go to space. And then I remembered the Challenger disaster. It was January 28th, 1986. I was in grade 4. And in my memory, I remember my teacher, Mrs. Holmes, wheeling in the TV on the TV cart so we could watch it. I can't quite remember if I watched it blow up there or at home, but I do remember her explaining to us what happened. Maybe they shut it off or something. And then, a few months later, there was another disaster that happened, the Chernobyl meltdown, on April 26, 1986. And once again, I remember Mrs. Holmes explaining to us what happened and telling us that we didn't have to be afraid about radiation blowing over here to Canada. But to me, that kind of fits this pattern I've been talking about. Fear of nuclear reactors and nuclear energy, and fear of going to space. In fact, after the Challenger disaster, they didn't go to space for 3 years. So it makes me wonder, were those incidents organic? Did they happen by accident? Or were they manufactured to somehow discourage humanity from wanting cheap energy and space exploration? Were those events engineered to keep humanity grounded? In a negative sense, I mean. So I thought to myself, well, I do know these elite and secret society occult types. They just love to use numbers. And I wonder how many days are between the Challenger disaster and the Chernobyl meltdown. Well, it turns out there are exactly 88 days in between these two disasters. And it's interesting that these two disasters really do serve to keep humanity grounded. To me, they serve this breakaway civilization's agenda. And as I looked into it more, I realized that H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. So 88 could represent HH. Now to me, that means nothing. But to Breakaway Civilization Nazi types, it actually means Hail Hitler.